Easy stuff first, your name and your position here, please.
Assistant Chief Abdul D. Pridgen, Assistant Chief Over Patrol Bureau.
Talk to me a little bit about use of force. I mean, let's just kind of get down to the simple facts of it. When can you use it? How much leeway are police officers given? Give me a good umbrella of what you guys have when it comes to use of force.
Well, we use the minimum amount of force necessary to effect an arrest. And what that means is the officer has a broad spectrum of force to utilize depending upon the circumstances of the incident. It could be anything from verbal commands all the way up to deadly force.
What sort of guidelines do you guys have as far as what needs to be in place in order for some use of force, any type of use of force to happen?
It's really the totality of the circumstances. One, what's going through the officer's mind at the time of the encounter. Two, what the witnesses have to say leading up to the officer's arrival on the scene. And three, the actions of the person that the officer is encountering.
Active resistance needs to be present, though.
Not necessarily.
The courts don't say active resistance need to be present?
I can tell you our policy stipulates that if an officer is in fear of physical harm or that someone else is going to be harmed, he or she can use force to stop that threat.
Active resistance or not?
Depending upon the circumstances, correct.
What about warning a person before any type of force is implemented? Is there a policy for that, a guideline? How does that work?
In a perfect world, if an officer has ample time to give warning, then that will happen. In some circumstances, there isn't enough time to warn someone that you are going to use force. And in those instances, an officer may use force prior to the warning.
Let's talk about the types of force that you guys can use. I know the different ones, but why don't we kind of go over them so I don't get them wrong? I know there's deadly force and non-deadly force.
I'll go from the least injurious all the way up to deadly force. We have officer presence. That's just an officer shows up on the scene and exerts his or her authority. Then you have open hand control and restraint, which is you grab someone, you might take them to the ground, you might put them in a wrist lock. Then you've got a taser, which is used to incapacitate someone while you make an arrest or while you do whatever else you need to do. You also have an Asst that can be used, which is an expandable baton. And then you have deadly force.
When you're dealing with the taser, I know that there's a lot of training that goes into it. What sort of training do officers get before they even get to hold one of these tasers?
There's a class that they have to go through. They sit through a lengthy PowerPoint presentation. There are also practical exercises that teach officers the capabilities of the taser, proper usage, and ultimately they have to test at the end to determine whether or not they are proficient in the use of a taser prior to being issued a taser.
If I'm not mistaken, you were around back in 2009 when the Jacobs case happened, correct?
Yes, I was around.
Okay. And the only reason why I know that is because I read a couple of the articles from back then. What was the learning point from that situation for officers when it came to tasers?
I can tell you I'm not familiar enough with the Jacobs case to make a comment on that. I was not over patrol at the time.
Okay. But you did give interviews about the Jacobs case?
No, I did not. I was not.
Okay.
I did not give interviews about the Jacobs case. I was around, meaning I was in the department. I did not give interviews.
Okay. So then let's go to tasers as far as when officers are encouraged to use them and when they're not encouraged, according to Fort Worth's policy. What are some of those stipulations in the policy?
If the officer believes that the subject is a threat to the officer or someone else, and any other means, meaning use of force, open hand control, is not sufficient in order to subdue the person. Additionally, if the officer feels that they could be harmed by just trying to go hands-on, meaning take physical control of the person, they are authorized to use the taser. So for example, if someone is exhibiting some type of martial arts stance, and it's obvious that they're trained, I'm not going to try to grab them. I'm going to give them a warning saying, I'm asking you to comply with my orders or I'm going to use the taser. That's an example where an officer has time to indicate to someone that they're going to use the taser.
Now, talking to Taser International, they mentioned to us that there are no studies, there is no data having to do with the taser, the use of tasers when it comes to children, any ages. I noticed this year you guys have used a taser on a 12-year-old and 3 14-year-olds. That seems a little different than what we've seen before.
As far as what you've seen before, meaning in the past?
In the past, in y'all's track record especially. I mean, in 2012, there wasn't anybody under the age of 15 that was exposed to a taser. Now you have a 12-year-old and 3 14-year-olds, and the year isn't even over yet.
I'm not familiar with those cases, but what I can tell you is the officers respond depending upon the situations that present themselves. Some 14-year-olds are larger than most adults, so it depends on the circumstances on whether or not an officer chooses to implement a taser. And again, It's what's going through the officer's mind at the time the taser is used and the threat presented by the person that the officer is trying to subdue.
Is it common to see officers use a taser on people or children for that matter younger than the age of 16?
I'm not familiar with cases where it has been used in our department, but it has been used across the city. Again, depending upon the circumstances. You don't often have children of that age offering that level of resistance to officers, so that's another reason why it wouldn't be used at the same rate to maybe with adults.
As the chief over the patrol division, whenever a use of force case it is input into the system,
Yes.
You guys review it depending on whether somebody was injured or not injured, whether it be the officer or not. How does that process work?
What happens is the use of force report is channeled through the chain of command, usually up through the captain, sometimes maybe the deputy chief, and the training division also reviews it to determine whether or not there are any lessons to be learned where we can use those lessons to implement in training in the future. So once those are reviewed by the chain of command and by the training division, then a determination is made whether or not policy was followed and whether or not it was in accordance with the way we train.
Where does it ever get to your desk then?
When there's a significant case where someone is severely injured, where what would be a critical police incident, where someone is seriously injured, someone died, or there is discipline that is going to stem from the use of force that was implemented.
What is the policy when it comes to people with medical needs, a medical detention case? Where does the policy stand, or and maybe I wasn't able to see it, I didn't see anything that mentioned how to handle those types of situations?
We actually have officers who are trained in how to deal with persons who are suffering mental distress or have some mental illness. Of course, we would like to have everyone in patrol trained to that standard. Unfortunately, we don't. But our policy does dictate whenever we respond to someone that has mental illness, 2 officers will respond along with the supervisor, and we will do everything in our power to safely bring that person into control if they are exhibiting a danger to themselves and others, and then get them help through some medical facility.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the Jermaine Darden case, the situation where the family claims he had definitely some medical attention that was needed. He had breathing issues, narcolepsy. Search warrant was served on his house, and after being tased, subsequently he died. Don't know if there was a result of the taser, but where are we on that case?
That case is currently still under investigation, so it would be inappropriate for me to make any comment regarding that case at this time.
Talk to me about the Jose Andrade case. I know that I mentioned it to Sergeant Peel, and it sounds like you might be familiar with this case.
Yes.
At least being able to review it. Mental detention case.
Correct.
Young man had slit his wrists and was walking down Riverside Drive. Where were the officers' actions right, correct? How did they follow the policy? From what you've read in the report.
Good question. The officers responded to a call of a suicidal person. And it actually was the brother that they encountered when they responded to the scene, who was a witness. And the brother told them that the subject, his brother, had slit his wrists and had left the residence. When officers finally caught up with the person that had been described as a suicidal person, they asked the person to stop. The person did not. He then turned toward the officers and started walking toward them. Was still bleeding. They weren't certain whether or not he was still armed with a weapon. The assist officer continued to give verbal commands, stop, get on the ground. The person did not comply. And that's when the officer deployed a taser in order to stop the threat that he perceived at the time.
What was that threat?
The threat was whether or not the person still might have had a weapon. He tried to slit his wrists. It's obvious that he had a sharp implement. He might have still had one on his person. So the officer was concerned for his safety.
The pictures that were taken for the report show Mr. Andrade without a t-shirt and with actually, I don't even know if he had shoes on at that point. Where would he possibly have, and maybe this is a naive question, but where would he have possibly hit an object, a knife? I mean, the officer could see that his 2 hands were out.
I haven't seen the pictures, but what I can tell you is that criminals are very resourceful, and we've encountered that time and time again. That's why officers do not take chances when they're uncertain, because that hesitation could cost an officer his or her life.
This was a medical detention case, though not a call for a criminal case.
Medical detention, however, with mental illness, people are unpredictable, and violence could erupt at any moment, and so the officer was fearful for his safety, and that's why he deployed a taser.
Is that case under review? I know you're talking about it, so I'm assuming that case probably isn't under review.
It is not under review. The officer followed our training and our protocol, which indicates that an officer is allowed to use the taser when they perceive a threat and when there is not enough time to give a warning, as in this case there wasn't, not to mention that there were other verbal commands for the subject to stop and get on the ground.
Also, we wanted to talk a little bit about, what started this situation was us looking into kind of Jermaine's case, and I know that that's still under investigation, but in the process, we got a hold of, all the use of force cases that you guys have had over the last 2 years, so since 2012. Last year, there was, roughly about 25 people that needed medical attention after being exposed to a taser. This year, it's 30. And the year isn't over yet. Why the increase of cases where someone needs medical attention?
That's a good question. I wish I had the information that you have reviewed so that I can review it and give you some discernible information regarding that, but I have not seen it, and I can't speculate on why that is. I really can't.
You don't regularly review the use of force cases, being Assistant Chief of the Patrol Division?
Many of them that don't involve policy violations or serious bodily injury or death do not make it to my desk.
When could we see, or what can be done differently? I don't know if that's kind of a weird question to ask, because in the moment, obviously, an officer's best judgment is being used. But what can be done differently in these types of situations for officers, and even maybe for the person who it might have the taser being shot at him at some point? Where's some good advice in those situations? Good
advice is to comply with the officer's instructions. Also, what I can tell you is when it comes to people with mental disabilities, we are working with the National Alliance for Mental Illness so that we can increase our service to not only people with mental illnesses, but also those family members who might be interested in what services we can provide. Back in March, actually predating this incident, members of our department reached out to NAMI and had conversations, and since then, we visited the Dallas Police Department to look at their policy and how they've implemented some of NAMI's recommendations, and we're looking forward to bringing that to our department and implementing it into policy.
What are the differences then? What are some of the things that you guys are looking at as possibly implementing here?
That information has not been brought to my desk. I'm aware of those conversations. Again, few things come to my level unless it's a situation that has to do with a departmental policy implementation. So once we get to the point where they see this as being credible and something worthwhile, they're bringing it to my attention, I will review it, and then we will implement it.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about the use of force? I mean, I know by far, looking at the stats, although you mentioned that you probably haven't seen these, but, I do have to ask, by far, the one weapon that is used most often is usually the taser when use of force is used. Why is that?
What I can tell you, and this dates back to probably 10 years ago when I started reviewing tasers when they were starting to be widely implemented, is that study after study after study that have been conducted independently by the Department of Justice and others have indicated that tasers and having tasers allows us to minimize the injuries to both officers and civilians. And what I can tell you is that officers often will have the option of using a more injurious level of force, but will opt to use the taser instead because they know that that will be less injurious to the subject.
If that's the case, then why are we seeing 30 cases where there was some sort of injury in less than a year?
Well, just because they went to the hospital doesn't necessarily mean there was an injury. Sometimes it's a precautionary measure, just to make sure nothing is wrong. So that doesn't in and of itself indicate that there's injury.
Okay, that's a good explanation. Thank you. I think we're good. Did we miss anything? Anything you'd like to clarify, touch back on?
No.
You sure?
No, I'm good.
Okay.